A loyal dog wouldn't stop barking in front of its owner's coffin, confusing everyone at the funeral. When people finally opened the coffin to investigate, they discovered something shocking. Before we dive deeper into this unbelievable true story, take a moment and tell in the comments, from which country are you watching this? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because what you're about to hear will shake your soul. Now let's begin. The story takes us to a quiet town in southern Poland, where life is slow, peaceful, and bound by old traditions. In that town lived a man named Tomasz Nowak, a humble carpenter known for his kindness and quiet strength. He lived alone in a small wooden house at the edge of the forest, with only one companion, his loyal dog, Burek. The two were inseparable. Burek followed Tomasz everywhere, to the marketplace, to the chapel, and even to the workshop, where the rhythmic tapping of hammer and chisel filled their days. But one cold winter night, everything changed. Snow fell silently over the town as Tomasz returned home from work. His breath came out in clouds as he walked up the narrow path to his door. Inside, the fire had gone out, and the house was filled with stillness. No sound but the creak of the floorboards beneath his boots. He sat down by the table, rubbing his tired hands, unaware that this night would be his last, or so everyone thought. The next morning, neighbors found him collapsed near the fireplace. His face was pale, his pulse undetectable. The local doctor, old and weary, checked for signs of life, but found none. "Heart failure," he murmured. It wasn't uncommon in men who worked too hard and lived alone. Within hours, the word spread: Tomasz was gone. Burek refused to leave his side. The dog whined and scratched at the door when men came to carry the body away. It followed the coffin to the churchyard, its eyes full of something no one could describe: confusion, fear, love, or perhaps all three. The funeral took place 2 days later. The town gathered inside the small wooden chapel to pay their respects. Candles flickered. The air smelled of wax and pine. Tomasz's body lay inside a simple wooden coffin, one he had built himself years ago, never knowing it would one day hold him. But as the priest began his final prayer, Burek's behavior grew strange. The dog began pacing in front of the coffin, growling under his breath. Then suddenly, he barked. Once. Twice. Then over and over, louder each time. The mourners frowned, shushing him, but he wouldn't stop. His claws scratched the wooden floor as he lunged toward the coffin, barking so violently that his voice echoed off the stone walls. No one understood. They tried to push the dog outside, but he slipped back and through a side door, running straight to the coffin again. His tail was stiff, his body trembling, and his eyes fixated on the wooden box as if he could sense something alive within. Some said he was mourning his master. Others whispered that animals could sense spirits, that maybe Tomasz's soul hadn't yet left this world. But an old woman sitting in the back of the chapel shook her head slowly. "That dog knows something," she murmured. "Something's wrong." Outside, the wind howled. Snow began to fall again, coating the ground in white silence. Inside, the barking continued, desperate, pleading, echoing through every corner of the chapel. Then came the moment no one expected. As one of the pallbearers approached the coffin to calm the dog, he froze. A faint sound, almost too soft to hear, came from inside. It wasn't the creak of wood. It wasn't the sound of settling. It was something else. Something human. A gasp swept through the crowd. People leaned closer, hearts pounding. The priest hesitated, clutching his cross. The pallbearer pressed his ear against the coffin's lid, and his eyes widened. There was a sound. A faint, rhythmic thump. Someone whispered, "It's impossible." But the dog barked again, a single, sharp bark that echoed like thunder. Panic broke out. Some shouted to open it, others warned to wait. But before anyone could decide, lightning cracked across the sky, shaking the chapel walls. The candles flickered wildly, shadows dancing across Tomasz's coffin as if the heavens themselves demanded the truth to be revealed. The dog whined, placing his paws against the wood, his nose pressed to the edge as if urging them to act faster. The townspeople hesitated, torn between fear and disbelief. Could it really be? Could a man declared dead still be alive? The air felt thick, charged with something unseen. Every second stretched into eternity. The priest, trembling, finally gave a nod. "Open it," he said quietly. The lid creaked. A hush fell over the crowd. The sound of splintering wood echoed in the stillness. One man pried open the coffin, and the scent of pine and candle wax filled the air. Everyone leaned forward breathless. And then, Tomash's fingers twitched. Just once, barely moving, but enough to make every heart in the room stop. The dog barked again, tail wagging furiously, as if shouting to the world, "I told you!" The crowd stumbled backward in shock. Some screamed. Others crossed themselves, whispering prayers. Because inside that coffin, the dead man had just moved. But that was only the beginning. For what happened next would reveal a truth no one in that quiet town could ever have imagined, a truth that blurred the line between life, death, and something far greater. The silence that followed was not peace, it was terror. Every eye in the chapel locked on the coffin where Tomasz Nowak lay. The dog, Burek, whimpered softly, his body pressed against the wood as though protecting his master from some unseen danger. The faint twitch of Tomasz's fingers had shattered the boundary between life and death, leaving the mourners frozen between awe and disbelief. At first, no one dared to move. The only sounds were the creaking of the chapel beams and the heavy breathing of the living who now questioned everything they knew about the dead. One of the men standing closest stepped forward cautiously, his hands shaking. He leaned over the open coffin and whispered a trembling prayer before daring to touch Tomasz's wrist. There it was again, the faintest pulse, weak but real. The man gasped and stumbled backward, nearly dropping the candle in his hand. "He's alive!" someone muttered. The words rippled through the crowd like a wave of electricity. People pushed closer, craning their necks to see. A woman fainted. Another began to cry. Burek barked again, not in warning this time, but in joy, spinning in circles and pawing at the air as if trying to wake Tomasz himself. The dog's instincts had been right all along. The priest stood motionless for a moment, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had buried countless souls in his years, but never, not once, had he seen death undone. He motioned for the men to lift Tomasz out, his voice trembling as he commanded, "Quickly, before it's too late!" The coffin was lowered to the floor, and Tomasz's body was gently lifted out and placed on a bench near the altar. His skin was pale, his lips bluish, his chest rising and falling so faintly it was almost invisible. Someone rushed to fetch the town's doctor, the same man who had declared him dead 2 days earlier. When the doctor arrived, the color drained from his face the moment he saw Tomasz breathing. He hurried forward, his hands trembling as he checked for signs of life again, pulse, breath, heartbeat. "This can't be," he whispered. "I examined him myself." But there was no denying it. The man who had been sealed inside a coffin, who had been mourned, prayed over, and nearly buried, was still alive. The church erupted in chaos. Some called it a miracle. Others said it was witchcraft, punishment, or divine intervention. But amid the confusion, one sound remained constant, the rhythmic thumping of Burek's tail on the floor, steady and certain, as though the dog had never doubted for a second that his master would return. Outside, the snowstorm had grown stronger. The chapel windows rattled as wind howled through the night, but inside, the air burned with life. The priest ordered the candles relit, the fire rekindled, and warm blankets fetched from nearby homes. The townsfolk gathered around Tomasz, whispering prayers for his recovery. Hours passed, and slowly, color began to return to his face. His fingers twitched again, his chest rose higher, and finally, with a long, ragged gasp, he exhaled. His first true breath in 2 days. The crowd erupted into cries of joy and disbelief. Some knelt weeping. Others stood in stunned silence. The priest crossed himself again and again, whispering, "A miracle! A true miracle!" But beneath the celebration, an unsettling question lingered. How could this happen? Tomasz had no heartbeat when he was declared dead. The doctor had checked twice. His skin had grown cold, his breathing ceased. Yet here he was, alive again. And if he hadn't truly died, what had happened to him during those 2 long, silent days inside that coffin? When dawn broke, the storm subsided. The snow lay thick and untouched outside, glittering like powdered glass. Inside the chapel, Tomasz was wrapped in layers of wool and set near the fire. Burek refused to leave his side, resting his head against Tomasz's motionless hand. The dog hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, only watched. By morning, Tomasz's eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, searching the ceiling, the flickering light, the faces hovering above him. He looked confused, fragile, as if waking from a nightmare too heavy to remember. The townspeople rejoiced. Bells rang in the distance. The priest announced that God had returned a man from the grip of death. But deep inside Tomasz's gaze, something darker stirred, something no one could quite understand. Though he was alive, he was not the same. He spoke little, moved slowly, and often stared at nothing for long stretches of time. When he finally tried to stand, he seemed weak, as if the ground beneath him no longer felt real. The doctor insisted he rest, that his body had suffered from lack of air, but there was something else in Tomasz's stillness, something almost haunted. For nights afterward, strange things began to happen in his home. Candles flickered without wind. Doors creaked though no one passed through. And sometimes Burek, who had once been the calmest of dogs, would start barking again in the dead of night, always facing the same direction, the small room where Tomasz now slept. The townspeople called it a blessing. But blessings, as history often shows, come with shadows. Some whispered that Tomasz had crossed into the world of the dead and returned carrying something with him. Others said his heart had stopped but his spirit had not gone far, that he had walked the thin line between this life and the next, and seen things no living man should see. Whatever it was, it had changed him forever. And though Burek had saved his life, the dog seemed increasingly restless, as if sensing something the humans could not. Some nights, Tomasz would wake to find Burek sitting by the door, staring into the darkness, growling low, not out of anger, but of warning. The miracle that had filled the town with joy soon gave way to unease. For deep in his heart, Tomasz carried memories that weren't his, voices whispering, faces without names, a cold that still clung to his bones. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't sleep. And when he finally closed his eyes, he would see the same thing over and over again, a dark corridor lined with countless doors, and behind one of them, something waiting for him to return. Burek would bark whenever Tomasz dreamed. He would howl at the soundless air, shaking, his fur standing on end. It was as though the dog was fighting something invisible, something trying to take his master back. Days passed. Tomasz grew weaker instead of stronger. The doctor couldn't understand it. His pulse was steady, but his body seemed to fade little by little, as if something was pulling him away from the living world once again. And one night, as the wind howled through the trees and the old house groaned under the weight of the snow, Burek began to bark again, louder than ever before. The neighbors heard it. The sound echoed through the valley, sharp and desperate. But when they came running toward the house, the lights inside had already gone out. The barking stopped. The silence returned. And inside that darkness, something had changed once more. The next morning, the town awoke to an unsettling quiet. The sun struggled to break through the thick clouds, casting pale light over a world still heavy with snow. But in the small wooden house at the edge of the forest, where Tomasz Nowak lived, something felt deeply wrong. The neighbors arrived early, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. The barking that had torn through the night had stopped so abruptly that it haunted their sleep. When they knocked, no one answered. The house seemed lifeless again, like the day Tomasz was first found. Dead. They pushed open the door. Inside, the air was cold, unnaturally cold. The fire in the hearth had long burned out. Candles sat melted on the table, their wicks black and twisted. And there, lying on the floor beside the bed, was Burek, breathing heavily, eyes half open, his fur damp with sweat. But Tomasz was gone. His bed was empty, the blanket pulled back as if he had risen in the middle of the night. On the wooden floor, faint footprints led toward the door, bare, human, and strangely uneven, like those of a man half awake or half alive. The door was ajar, snow blown in by the wind. Beyond it lay the forest, silent and white, stretching endlessly into the distance. The villagers called out his name, their voices swallowed by the woods. There was no answer. Only the low growl of the wind moving between the trees. They searched for hours. By midday, one of them found a clue, near the frozen river at the forest's edge, footprints again. But this time, there was only one set. The other disappeared halfway across the snow, as if the man they belonged to had simply vanished into thin air. Tomasz was never found that day. The priest said perhaps he had wandered away, confused or ill. The doctor blamed shock and exhaustion. But the old woman who had spoken during the funeral, the one who said the dog knew something, she whispered a different truth. She said, "The dead never return without a price." That night, the townspeople gathered in the chapel to pray. They prayed for Tomasz's safety, for peace, for answers. But outside, in the distance beyond the snow-covered hills, Björk's howl echoed once more, long, drawn-out, mournful. Days passed. Then weeks. The forest grew darker with each night. Some villagers claimed to see strange lights between the trees, flickering like lanterns. Others swore they heard footsteps following them home from the river. And one evening, when the priest returned to his chapel after sunset, he found something waiting for him by the altar. A wooden cross had been knocked over. The candles had burned out. And on the front pew, covered in frost, lay Tomasz's carpenter's apron, stiff, cold, and dusted with snow. It was the same apron he had worn the day he died. Word spread quickly. People locked their doors earlier, refused to walk alone after dark. But Björk would not stay inside. Every night, the dog sat outside the old house, staring into the forest, tail motionless, eyes fixed on the blackness. He would sit there until dawn, whimpering quietly, as if waiting for something to return. And then, one night, it did. The storm came suddenly, furious and wild. Wind tore through the trees, snow spun like ghosts in the air. The townspeople stayed hidden indoors, but Björk stayed at his post, growling into the blinding white darkness. The forest groaned. Branches cracked. And from within that chaos came a sound, slow footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving closer. Out of the blizzard, a shadow appeared. At first it looked like a man, bent, tired, his clothes torn and frozen. His skin was gray, his lips pale. It was Tomasz. Or at least, something that looked like him. He stumbled toward the house, eyes unfocused, his breath visible in the cold. Björk whimpered, unsure whether to bark or run. But as the man reached the doorway, he stopped and looked down at the dog. And for a long moment neither moved. Then Tomasz spoke, though no words came from his lips. His mouth didn't move. But in that silence, Björk heard it. A whisper, deep and hollow, not in his ears but inside his mind. The dog backed away slowly, whining, tail between his legs. The shadow stepped forward, into the house, closing the door behind him. By morning, when the neighbors came again, the snow had stopped. Smoke rose from the chimney for the first time in days. They knocked on the door. No answer. They peered through the window and saw movement inside. Tomasz sitting at his table, staring at the wall. Relief washed over them. They thought the nightmare had ended. But when they entered, their joy turned to dread. The man sitting there looked like Tomasz, but his eyes were wrong. They were dark, empty, almost glassy, reflecting no light. His skin was pale and dry, his hands trembling as if they no longer obeyed him. The villagers spoke to him, but he didn't respond. He just sat there, silent, unmoving, his dog lying at his feet, shivering. They left quickly, uneasy, unsure what they had just seen. Over the next few days, the town changed. Crops withered despite the cold. The river began to freeze earlier than usual. And the church bells rang at odd hours, though no one was there to pull the ropes. One night, the priest himself ventured to Tomasz's home. He found the door open again, candles flickering inside, and Tomasz standing before the mirror, staring at his reflection as though seeing a stranger. The priest called out, but Tomasz didn't move. His reflection, however, did. The reflection blinked before Tomasz did. The reflection smiled, even though Tomasz's lips did not. The priest fled, stumbling into the snow, his cross clutched tight in his hand. The next morning, he was found near the chapel steps, alive but shaken beyond reason, muttering the same words again and again. "He didn't come back alone! He didn't come back alone!" From that night onward, the town of Krosno changed forever. The air grew colder, heavier. Shadows lingered where they shouldn't. And every time Burek barked, the people would fall silent, listening, remembering what had happened that day in the church, and wondering if the miracle they had celebrated had in fact opened a door that was never meant to be opened. As for Tomasz, he rarely left his house again. He spent his days carving wooden crosses, one after another, lining the walls with them until the place resembled a shrine. Sometimes, at night, passers-by claimed to see him standing outside, barefoot in the snow, staring at the forest as if waiting for something, or someone, to return. And always, at his feet, sat Burek. But the dog's eyes were no longer the same either. They were tired, haunted, as though he had seen something too great for even a creature's heart to bear. And deep inside that house, beneath the endless creak of wood and whisper of wind, something else began to stir. A heartbeat, slow, steady, not quite human. Growing stronger each night. Waiting. Night settled heavy over Krosno, swallowing the town in a silence so thick it pressed against the windows. The wind had stopped, the snow no longer fell, yet the cold deepened, as though the earth itself had forgotten warmth. In the small house at the forest's edge, a single candle burned beside Tomasz's bed. Its flame trembled, stretching long shadows across the walls crowded with wooden crosses. The crosses should have felt protective, but instead they looked like witnesses, countless eyes carved in wood, watching something they could not stop. Burek lay beside the bed, breathing unevenly. His ears twitched at the faint sound pulsing through the floorboards, that strange, slow heartbeat that had begun days ago. It didn't come from Tomasz. It came from beneath. From the ground itself. Tomasz sat upright, eyes half open, pale face glistening with sweat. He hadn't truly slept since his return. Each time he closed his eyes he saw the same place, an endless corridor of stone, doors stretching to infinity, each one breathing faint light through its cracks. He never remembered walking there before the coffin, yet it was familiar, terrifyingly so. Each night, one door opened farther than the last, and a voice whispered from behind it, soft as snow but heavy with command, "Come back." He tried to ignore it. He carved more crosses, fed the fire, prayed without sound. But the voice grew clearer, closer, until he could almost feel its breath at his ear even when awake. And when he looked at his reflection in the window, sometimes it mouthed words he hadn't spoken. That night, as the candle flickered lower, the heartbeat beneath the floor grew louder, thud, thud, thud. Burek lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His fur bristled, nose pointing toward the trapdoor leading to the cellar. The dog had never gone down there since Tomasz's resurrection. No one had. Tomasz followed the sound with empty eyes. He rose, each step slow, mechanical, as though guided by something unseen. The boards creaked under his weight. When he reached the trapdoor, the heartbeat paused, then resumed faster. He knelt, hands trembling, and pulled it open. A breath of freezing air rushed upward, carrying with it a smell of damp earth and something metallic. The candlelight barely touched the darkness below. Burek barked once, sharp and terrified, but Tomasz descended anyway. Down there, the walls were lined with shelves of his old carvings, crucifixes, saints, and angels, each coated in dust. Yet one wall was bare, the wood newly disturbed. The heartbeat pulsed from behind it. He reached out and touched the boards. They were warm. And then, faintly, they breathed. Tomasz staggered backward, heart pounding. The whisper filled the cellar now, no longer distant but all around him. "You were mine. You left too soon. He stumbled up the steps, slamming the trapdoor shut, gasping for air. Burek barked wildly, circling, trying to drive whatever it was back underground. But the heartbeat continued, echoing through the walls, matching Tomasz's own pulse until he could no longer tell which was his. Outside, the forest began to move. Branches swayed though there was no wind. Snow shifted in waves, like something crawling beneath it. The villagers, already fearful, woke to distant barking and the dull tremor of earth. Lights flickered in their homes. The church bell tolled once, then stopped, its ropes swaying without touch. Inside the house, Tomasz collapsed to his knees. He pressed his hands over his ears, but the whisper sank deeper, beneath thought, beneath bone. Images flashed before him, the coffin lid above his face, the suffocating darkness, the faint spark of life that refused to fade. He remembered pounding weakly against the wood, calling for help no one could hear, except Burek. But there was something else he remembered now, something he hadn't told anyone. In that suffocating dark, when his heart had slowed to nothing, another presence had been there with him. It had spoken softly, promising warmth, breath, return, if only he would open the door that waited beyond the corridor of stone. Desperate, terrified, he had said yes. Now he understood what that bargain had meant. The door had followed him back. And whatever waited behind it was no longer content to whisper. Burek lunged toward the crosses, knocking one from the wall. It shattered on the floor, and the sound echoed unnaturally loud, like thunder in a hollow sky. The heartbeat stopped. Silence returned so sudden it rang in the ears. Tomasz dared to breathe again, but the relief lasted only a moment. From the broken cross, a thin crack spread across the floorboards, glowing faintly red. The air thickened, hot and heavy. The boards buckled. Then, with a deafening snap, the trapdoor burst open. A column of cold wind shot upward, blowing out the candle. Darkness swallowed everything. Tomasz screamed, a hoarse, dry sound, as unseen hands seemed to pull at him from below. Burek lunged, teeth flashing, biting at empty air, dragging his master backward by the sleeve. For a second it worked. Tomasz crawled toward the door, gasping for breath. But something stronger yanked him back, slamming the trapdoor shut with both of them still inside the house. Outside, the villagers saw the lights flare through the windows, first red, then blue, then gone. They rushed through the snow, banging on the door, shouting. No answer. Only the faint echo of barking from within. When they finally forced the door open, the room was empty. The floor was scorched black around the trapdoor, the crosses reduced to ash. The trapdoor itself hung open, revealing only darkness below. No sign of Tomasz. No sign of Burek. The villagers sealed the cellar and left the house abandoned. They said prayers, sprinkled holy water, begged the priest to bless the ground. Yet even after the rites, they could feel it, the heartbeat, faint but persistent, deep beneath the earth. Weeks later, travelers passing through the forest reported hearing a dog barking somewhere among the trees, though no tracks were found. Sometimes, late at night, the villagers still saw a candle flicker in the window of the abandoned house, burning against the wind. And on the coldest nights, when the snow lay thickest and the moon hid behind the clouds, the people of Krosno swore they could hear two sounds coming from the frozen ground beneath their feet. The steady, sorrowful bark of a faithful dog, and the answering beat of a heart that refused to stay dead. Winter never left Krosno after that night. It was as though the season itself had frozen in fear. The forest stood silent and skeletal, its trees buried to their knees in snow. The villagers stopped venturing near the house at the edge of the woods, the house that once belonged to Tomasz Nowak, the man who had died, lived again, and vanished into darkness. No birds sang there anymore. No footprints marked the ground. Only the wind, whispering faintly through the branches, spoke of what had happened. Yet the story did not end in silence. Because sometimes, when the wind was right, people still heard it, the faint, rhythmic barking of a dog echoing through the trees. Some said it was just the sound of the wind twisting through the pines. Others claimed they saw a golden shadow move between the snowdrifts, loyal and watchful. But a few swore they saw something far more unsettling, a man walking beside the dog, moving slowly through the mist, his face pale, his eyes dark, and his footsteps leaving no imprint behind. The priest, old and frail, carried the guilt of that miracle until his final days. He had blessed the coffin. He had declared it a sign of divine mercy when Tomasz rose from death. But in the stillness of the chapel at night, he sometimes whispered prayers to undo what had been done. One evening, many months later, he decided to face his fear. Carrying a lantern and his worn wooden cross, he made the long walk through the snow to the abandoned house. The door hung half open, creaking gently in the wind. Inside, everything was exactly as it had been left. Tools scattered across the workbench, a layer of frost on every surface, and walls blackened with soot where the crosses had burned. The priest's lantern cast trembling light across the floor. The boards groaned beneath his weight. He knelt and began to pray aloud, voice trembling, begging whatever restless spirit remained to find peace. But before he could finish, he heard it, the heartbeat. Faint. Slow. Coming from below. He turned toward the trapdoor. It was still sealed with iron nails from when the villagers had tried to lock it forever. But as he approached, his lantern flickered. The flame bent sharply toward the floor, as if drawn by something unseen. Then came the sound that froze his blood, a bark. Soft. Muffled. From beneath the wood. The priest's knees gave out. The lantern slipped from his hand and rolled across the floor, its flame sputtering against the cold air. "Lord, have mercy," he whispered. The barking grew louder, not frantic, but steady, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat itself. And then, through the cracks between the boards, something shone, faint golden light, like the color of Burik's fur in sunlight. The priest gathered his courage and pried the nails free, one by one, each creak louder than the last. When the final nail came loose, a blast of freezing air rushed upward. The lantern went out completely. Darkness swallowed the room. But in that darkness he saw them. Tomasz stood at the bottom of the steps, his form faintly visible, as if made of light and shadow combined. His face was calm, almost peaceful. Beside him sat Burik, tail gently wagging, eyes bright and warm. For a long moment, the priest could only stare, tears filling his eyes. The man who had defied death raised his head slowly, and though his lips did not move, his voice filled the priest's mind, the same hollow, echoing tone that had haunted the dog before. "It was never meant to be a miracle," the voice said. "It was a warning." The priest trembled. "Warning?" he whispered into the empty air. "Between life and death lies a door," the voice continued. "When you open it, something always follows you back. But some bonds—" Tomasz looked down at Burik, his hand resting on the dog's head, "are stronger than even death itself." The light surrounding them began to fade. The priest, blinded by tears, reached forward, begging for forgiveness, for understanding, but his hands met only cold air. Tomasz and Burik were gone. When the villagers found the priest the next morning, he was kneeling before the open trapdoor, alive but motionless, his lantern extinguished beside him. He spoke only one sentence before falling silent forever. Love brought him back, and love took him home. Weeks later, a thaw began. The snow melted slowly, revealing the ground beneath for the first time in months. Children exploring near the edge of the forest stumbled upon something strange, a patch of earth where the snow refused to stay, warm even in the cold. They called for the elders, and together they dug. Just beneath the surface, they found a coffin. Old. Wooden. The same one Tomasz had once been buried in. But inside it wasn't Tomasz's body. There was only a small wooden cross, freshly carved, and beside it, the collar of a dog, still glinting faintly in the sunlight. The villagers buried the coffin again, this time with prayers not for the dead, but for the peace of the living. And from that day onward, the forest was calm once more. No more barking. No more strange lights. The snow lay still. But legends have a way of breathing even when hearts do not. Years later, travelers still spoke of Krosno, of the carpenter who returned from the grave and the dog who saved him. Some called it a miracle of faith. Others called it a curse born from love too deep to let go. Yet no matter how they told it, one thing never changed. It was the dog's loyalty that pierced the veil between worlds. And sometimes, on the quietest winter nights, when the moon sits low and pale over the frozen forest, a faint sound still carries through the air, the soft bark of a faithful friend, guarding his master forever. A reminder that even death must bow before devotion. The miracle no one could have imagined was never that a man lived again. It was that a dog's love refused to let him die alone.